Well, I mean, that ties into my next question, really, because it's clear that many of these cities not only have a history, but also are part of myth from the way in which they are founded or the heroes who might be associated with them. And so you've got that running in parallel, the sort of their sense of themselves or the later civilization's sense of what they meant.
Yeah, well, Greek word myth, of course. So myth originally means just a story, but then it comes to be applied specifically to certain kinds of stories, and especially ones about the gods or about the heroes of the distant past. And that's where the foundation myth comes in. And each city has its own foundation myth. Some we know better than others. One I particularly like. It involves no supernatural phenomena. It's just humans, but it's the foundation myth of Marseille, Massalia, and there are two versions, slightly different names, same notion that Greeks come along, they found this settlement, and living there or nearby are, of course, non-Greeks, natives, Celts of the Ligurian branch of the Celtic people. And it's the sort of John Smith and Pocahontas scenario. In other words, the local chieftain offers his daughter to the leader of the incoming settlers, and the myth is that they get on terribly well and they have mutually interests in common, so that the Celts get Greek wine, they get Greek olive oil, and in return the Greeks get access to land, trading facilities, and women. And this was another thing that struck me very forcibly. I'd of course thought about it before, but whereas typically I think in colonization movements, Spanish or North American in more recent times, typically women go out as well, maybe not initially, but pretty soon after. Well, in the Greek case, it seems that very rarely did Greek women follow the men to go to settle all round the Mediterranean and Black Sea areas, and so therefore the Greeks had to find women from the locals. And there are actually one or two stories. There's a famous one about the women of Cyrene, which is another city I would love to have put in what's today Libya. The women there were so culturally different that even after their daughters and so on had become completely Hellenized, the women still would not eat with their husbands. So when men are having a party, then typically respectable women are not present. But when a man is simply having his evening meal, as it were, at home, in Greece, it would typically be the case that his wife would eat with him, but never would the women of Cyrene sit down with their men, because they had a memory, allegedly, that the first men had not treated the women terribly gently. In other words, it had been more a kind of rape and pillage rather than, "Hello, my darling, and shall we settle down together?" which I imagine is actually quite usual. I would imagine a kind of Viking scenario rather than a peaceful coexistence. And so foundation myth stories are a very interesting way of getting into what it was like for actually the majority of Greek settlements, because the majority are outside the old Pale of settlement.
Now, what about the relationship between the Greek city-states? Is it fair to see it as predominantly one of mutual antagonism and internecine strife?
It is fair to see it predominantly as one of mutual antagonism, not necessarily outright hostility, but Plato, for example, imagines, as this is as late as the 4th century BC, when you would have imagined maybe they'd had time to sort of settle down and get on with each other, but he treats war as the default situation. Peace is odd, and he advocates it, and actually he speaks about within cities, Greeks being at war with each other. And of course antagonism is a word of Greek derivation. Their word agon, which can mean a contest, which can be fairly peaceful, but it can also mean war, or it can mean a lawsuit. And the word derived from agon, agonia, means competitiveness, and it's from that our word agony comes. So they are deeply competitive, which is one explanation, I think, of their extraordinary achievements, way beyond what would have been predicted given their very low, by later standards, economic and technological base.
Should we think of Athens as a case apart, or merely the sort of most perfect manifestation of what Greek civilization was?
Athens is a case apart, and one reason for that is that it absorbed well over 100 other villages. In other words, there's the city of Athens, which is where the Acropolis is, which is a whacking great rock and is an obviously attractive phenomenon, very suitable for defense. But the city-state of Athens, the polis or city-zen state, encompassed over 100 other settlements. And so to achieve a common identity, a common political structure within Athens, that, I think, is a bit of a clue to the fact that they're then able to go on and express themselves externally. But they never got on well with their neighbours. To the west, Megara; to the north, the Boeotians, and especially Thebes. And there was a proverbial saying, an Attic neighbour, that is, an Athenian neighbour, which means a bloody awful neighbour. In other words, Athenians were not comfortable people to live next to, and one of the things they did, some of those villages I mentioned, they actually nicked from their neighbours. They brought them over and then incorporated them with the Athenian state, villages that were on the frontier. So Athens, on the one hand, is exceptionally large and diverse, and that's the first start. It then has these wonderful ports, which not every Greek city has, which it exploits. It has pretty good economic base in agricultural terms, in that it's very, very suitable for the growth of the olive. And olives not only can be consumed internally, but they're also a major export crop. Athens then, politically, now you couldn't have predicted this, went through all the stages that other Greek cities did. But whereas most Greek cities ended up with some form of oligarchy, that is, a few citizens ruling, Athens, by various turns, unpredictably ended up with a form of democracy. Now, democracy can take different forms itself. Aristotle identified 4 different kinds of democracy, 4 different ways in which democratic government can be effected. And the Athenian way so happened to favour also the development of high culture. And I'll just give one example, and that is drama. Good Greek word. But first tragedy, then comedy, art forms that are clearly ancestral to what we understand by tragedy and comedy, were developed in a thoroughly democratic way, in a democratic arena. The funding was arranged centrally. The purpose was to do good for the people, and the people judged. We mentioned competition. The plays were put on competitively, and it was ordinary Athenians who decided who won the prize for acting, for production, for the play as a whole.